Key to understanding Aristotle's views in epistemology and metaphysics is understanding his views on logic, a discipline he essentially invented. This is true for two reasons. The simpler reason is that he references logical terms in his other works all the time, so it helps to know about his logical works when you are trying to read other stuff of his. The other reason is that certain facts about the system of logic he developed are important to the reasons he has for other things he believes. For example, in a roundabout way, Aristotle's views on logic lead to his rejection of the evolution of species over time, a view that was around in ancient Greece that he was aware of. But he rejects the idea that species change over time from one species to another because of his views on logic. He decides that every species that exists must always have existed. Now, Aristotle's logical works are commonly grouped together into a set of texts called the Organon. It was not called that by Aristotle himself. It's not even clear that Aristotle thought it made sense to group that particular set of texts together that way. The texts that are grouped into the Organon are the categories on interpretation, the topics, the sophistical refutations, the prior analytics, and the posterior analytics. What I'm going to talk about in this video is the prior analytics. The prior analytics is where Aristotle lays out what we would now call his logical system. Now, first, let me say a little something about what logic is. It's very common in English to use the words logic or logical to just mean good thinking. When someone tells you to think logically, they're trying to tell you to just think in general terms well, which usually means they want you to agree with them. However, in philosophy, these terms have a lot more precise meaning than that. Logic is the discipline that studies reasoning and arguments. Logic says when reasoning is good or bad, and it does this by reconstructing reasoning as arguments. It then tells you when arguments are good or bad. Now, arguments consist of premises and conclusions. Conclusions are what is argued for, and premises are the evidence put forward to prove the conclusions. You can evaluate arguments in two ways. One is to evaluate the premises as to their truth. So an argument with false premises isn't really going to prove its conclusion. Even if the conclusion is true, you can't prove that it is true with false premises. Now, another way to evaluate arguments is to determine how well the premises, if they're true, would prove the conclusion. Sometimes the premises of an argument can be true, but not prove the conclusion, right? So it's not the case that anytime you got true premises, you're going to have a conclusion that they prove, right? So for example, consider the following argument. Premise 1, all fish are animals. Premise 2, some animals are mammals. Conclusion, so all fish are mammals. That argument has true premises, but a false conclusion. So clearly, the premises don't prove the conclusion is true. Can't prove what's false. But sometimes you can have true premises and a true conclusion, but the premises still don't prove the conclusion. For example, all donkeys are mammals. Some mammals are dogs. No donkeys are dogs. In that case, the premises are true, the conclusion is true, but the premises don't actually prove the conclusion. And sometimes the premises do prove the conclusion is true, such as in the following. Premise 1, all donkeys are mammals. Premise 2, all mammals are animals. Conclusion, so all donkeys are animals. All right, so that's an argument where the premises are true and they prove the conclusion. Arguments can have premises that would, if they were true, prove that the conclusion was true even when the premises are false, right? So you can sometimes have premises that are false, but if they were true, they would prove that the conclusion was true. So for example, premise 1, all fish are mammals. Premise 2, all mammals are plants. Conclusion, so all fish are plants. Neither the conclusion nor the premises are true in that argument I just gave. But if the premises are true, then hopefully you can see that the conclusion would also have to be true. When an argument's premises don't prove its conclusion, in that the premises could be true, but the conclusion could still be false, we call the argument invalid. An argument is valid when it's the case that the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Logic, as a discipline, studies arguments to see when arguments are valid or invalid. Now, you might think that this is kind of odd. The arguments I have above are all arguments about biological taxonomy. Shouldn't biologists be the people to tell us when those arguments are good and when they're not? Now, the right response here is that biologists are the ones we should turn to if we want to know whether the premises in those arguments are true. But logic is where we go to determine if the arguments are valid or not. Why is this? What is there besides the biological facts to determine whether the arguments are valid? Why shouldn't biology handle it? And if you change the arguments to be about physics, why wouldn't physics be the discipline we turn to determine whether the arguments are any good? This is basically to ask what logicians bring to the table, or in other words, what makes logic possible as a legitimate independent discipline. And the answer comes from Aristotle's key insight, which is that what the arguments are about doesn't matter when it comes to whether or not they are valid. In the arguments above, you could take away all the things that make them about biology, all the references to living creatures, and you could still tell that the arguments are valid or invalid, as the case may be. So take the first example I gave. All fish are animals, some animals are mammals, so all fish are mammals. Now let's take out all mention of things that a biologist would be in a special position to know about. And that would be to take out mention of fish, animals, and mammals. Now, if we were to just take them out, then all we'd be left with are the words all, are, some, and so in a weird jumble. Right? Wouldn't be an argument anymore. So instead, we replace the words that we took out with letters, leaving us with all F are N, some N are M, and in conclusion, all F are M. This argument is invalid, and it can be shown to be invalid without having to rely on any special knowledge about what F, N, or M are. In fact, no matter what you put in for F, N, or M, you could change what they stand for. No matter what you put in their place, though, the argument would still be invalid. This step of removing all the terms that refer to something in the world that you need special knowledge to evaluate and replacing them with what are essentially variables is called formalization. You take away the substance of the sentences, what they're about, to reveal the structure or the form of the sentences. And Aristotle was the first to realize that once you did this, once you stripped away the substance and just left the form, the fact about which arguments are valid or invalid could be determined with certainty, and that this knowledge could be deployed across all areas of thought. What was true for biological arguments would be true for ethical arguments, would be true for physics arguments, would be true for political arguments. This is the basic idea of logic, that the form of sentences matter, and that their substance does not, when it comes to validity. Now, everything I have told you so far is true for a kind of logic called deductive logic. What is deductive logic? Well, it's the branch of logic that deals with deductive reasoning and deductive arguments. What are deductive arguments? Well, deductive arguments are the kinds of arguments that can achieve validity. You might be realizing this isn't all that helpful. The reason I bring it up is that, as we will see, there is another kind of reasoning, another kind of argument. It's called induction or inductive reasoning, or inductive arguments. But we aren't going to get to induction until we look at what Aristotle has to say about the origin of knowledge, because it's out of arguments that Aristotle makes that the idea of induction gets developed. So for now, let's just stick to deductive logic, which is what Aristotle's logical work, The Prior Analytics, concerns. So, you might have noticed something about the example arguments I've been using. They've all been arguments with two premises. Also, those premises involved claims about some property being true of all, none, or some category. The reason for this is that the kinds of arguments Aristotle's logical system was concerned with all had these features. Aristotle was concerned with categorical syllogisms. A syllogism is a deductive argument that has two premises. The premises and conclusions of these syllogisms all relate one class of things, the subject of the sentence, to some other class of things, the predicate. Because the subject and the predicate can both be thought of as names of classes or categories, we call the premises categorical. And so the syllogisms are categorical syllogisms. So to use the example of a valid argument from earlier, all donkeys are mammals, all mammals are animals, so all donkeys are animals. The first premise says all donkeys are mammals. So it says that all of one class, donkeys, is, in a sense, within the class of mammals. The first premise of a categorical syllogism is called the major premise. The second is called the minor premise. The function of the two premises, major and minor, in a categorical syllogism is to link the terms found within them. So in the major premise, there will be a term that does not appear in the minor premise, and vice versa. These two terms, the major, which appears only in the major premise, and the minor, which appears only in the minor premise, will be linked in the conclusion, in which both of them will appear. The remaining term, the one that appears in both premises, is called the middle term. So in this argument, the major term is donkeys, the middle term is mammals, and the minor term is animals. The reason to share this terminology is that Aristotle uses it in texts we will read. But there's more. Categorical propositions can be distinguished by their quantity and their quality. Quantity is basically a matter of how much of the subject term the propositions are talking about. So in the above example, in the major premise, all donkeys are mammals, that premise is universal because it is saying something about all donkeys, all of the subject term. And in this case, actually both premises and the conclusion are universal, but that doesn't have to be true. As an example, consider the following argument. Premise 1, some fish are carnivorous. Premise 2, all carnivores are hunters. Premise 3, so some fish are hunters. In that argument, the major premise was not universal, but particular. It isn't saying something about all fish, it's only saying something about some fish. Now, the word some sounds like it is still talking about multiple fish, so why call it particular? The reason is that all you need to make the claim some fish are carnivorous true is one carnivorous fish. The claim can be made true by a particular fact. In addition to quantity, there's also quality. The quality of a categorical proposition can be affirmative or negative. So if I say all donkeys are mammals, I am making an affirmative claim. I am saying something is true of all donkeys. In particular, I'm saying that they're mammals. But if I were to say no donkeys are reptiles, I would be making a negative claim about donkeys. I am saying there is something that is not true about really any donkey, that is being a reptile. As you can tell, there are four possible combinations here: universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative. So there we have some terminology. But how does all this help with validity? Well, if you only allow these four statements into your logical system, these four kinds of statements, you actually can show when arguments are valid or not visually using Venn diagrams. So back to our original argument from earlier. All donkeys are mammals, all mammals are animals, so all donkeys are animals. All right, so you can do a different Venn diagram for each one of the propositions here. And if you're not familiar with Venn diagrams, hopefully what I'm about to do will explain it. So let's take the first one. All donkeys are mammals. To To represent this with a Venn diagram, you draw two circles that are overlapping. Now, the next step is to take these two circles, each one of which represents one of the terms in the proposition. So let's say the left-hand one represents donkeys, so D. The right-hand one represents mammals, so M. What you do now is you show the information presented in the proposition on the diagram. And the way you do this is, to my mind, entirely counterintuitive, but it's the standard way of doing Venn diagrams, so I'm going to teach you the standard way, so that if you take a logic course after this and they teach you the standard way, you're not going to be confused. Assuming you remember what happens in this class. So, all donkeys are mammals. That means in the circle, that's donkeys. Right? So all the donkeys are inside this circle, the left-hand circle. Because all donkeys are mammals, that means all the donkeys are in the intersection between donkeys and mammals. Or in other words, within the circle of donkeys, the area that's outside of the circle of mammals is empty. And the counterintuitive thing is that the way you represent that part of the circle is empty is you shade it in, which of course means it's full. It's got color in it, which is why it's counterintuitive, but this is the way people do it. So in order to show that the part of the circle, the part of the donkey circle, that's not inside the circle of mammal is empty, is you shade it in. So that's what we'll do. Again, this looks to me like this part of the circle is full. If I could go back in time and change the way we did this, I would. So what this says is all the donkeys are inside the circle mammal. Right? All right. The next two ones are going to look pretty similar because these are all universal claims. So all mammals are animals. And we've got two circles here. We've got, that's a very bad circle. We've got M for mammals, and I think I used N before for animals. So all of the area in the mammal circle that's outside of the animal circle is empty, so we color that in. And finally, we have the conclusion. All donkeys are animals. Same two circles. I chose a very simple argument for this purpose, for this demonstration. They're not always going to be the exact same Venn diagram, but I did it because this is the easiest one to do the next step on. All right, so that's the Venn diagrams for the propositions taken individually. But this doesn't tell you anything about whether the argument is valid. How can you use Venn diagrams to show that the argument is valid? Well, each one of these Venn diagrams has two circles because for each proposition there are only two terms. And remember that with a categorical syllogism, you have three terms. So we're going to need three circles if we're going to map out the entire argument. Right? So let's go down here. So this one will be for, let's call it the whole argument. So you just draw three intersecting circles. So we start out with this, you have another one, then get this one. Right? And it's important that it have this shape, right? The shape where all three circles are intersecting, meaning each one overlaps the other two. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to use this to map every kind of argument. All right, we'll give them each a name. So the top left is D for donkey, the top right is M for mammal, the bottom is N for animal. Now, premise one said that all donkeys are mammals. So what we do is we shade out all the parts of the donkey circle that aren't in the mammal circle. That means this section here, that's off on its own, not intersecting with anything else, but it also means the intersection of donkey and animal that isn't also
part of the intersection of donkey and mammal, that also gets shaded out. Right? Because it's basically this picture over here from the first proposition. Everything that's not in the intersection of D and M is empty. So now we do premise 2, all mammals are animals. All right, so that means every part of the mammals circle that's not in the animal circle is shaded out. So that's this part. But it's also the intersection of D and M that's not part of the intersection of M and N. So we have that. This is the picture after we have the first two premises sort of modeled in this Venn diagram. The question then becomes whether whether it's going to be true that all donkeys are animals on this more complicated picture. And we can check. And the way we check is we look for whether there's any part of the donkey's circle or Venn circle that is outside of the Venn circle of animals. Whether there's any D that's outside of N but has stuff in it. And the answer is there's not. The only part of D that is not empty, the only part that's not shaded, is this part here. Right, so I'll do a little X here. X actually has a meaning in this, so I'm actually going to delete that. So I'll just, there. The only part of D that is non-empty is the part of D that is part of N as well. Right? So that means all the donkeys are here. They're in this spot, right in the middle. And as a result, that means that all the donkeys are in the N circle, which means they're all animals, which means that after you model the first two premises using the Venn diagrams, what's revealed is that the conclusion has to be true, which just means that the argument is valid. Because remember, a valid argument is one where if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And with Venn diagrams, you can actually show that visually. You can show visually that once the premises are true, which you model in the Venn diagram by shading in the parts that I did, you can show that the conclusion is true by showing that the only part of the, in this case, the D circle that's empty, or that is not shaded in rather, is also in the N circle. So that's how you can use Venn diagrams to show validity. And very often when you learn categorical logic for the first time, you do a lot of Venn diagrams. I'm only going to do the one. I'm not going to require you to do any. This is all just to give you background.
So Venn diagrams allow you to just check visually whether an argument is valid. But a genuine system of logic doesn't rely on visual presentations. Venn diagrams are useful for thinking your way through arguments sometimes, and they're useful for teaching categorical logic or Aristotle's logic. But a logical system needs rules saying which kinds of inferences are valid and which aren't. Now, with such a small set of elements, just two premises per argument, each of which can only be one of four types of claim, we can actually go through, and Aristotle did go through, and find every possible valid argument that's expressible in his system. So one way of checking for validity is just to check whether the argument you are making is on the list of valid types of arguments. Just to show you, here it is. Here's the list. So I'm not going to explain to you exactly what this notation is, but basically each one of these is a kind of argument you can make. So 1, 2, 3, 4 here in the first figure, 4 in the second figure, and 6 in the third figure. Don't worry about what the figures are. These are arguments you can make, syllogisms you can make in Aristotelian logic. They were actually given names during the Middle Ages, so that's what the mnemonic is. So this argument was just called Barbara. So one thing you can do is just go check, is each inference I'm making on this list? But even this way of checking for validity is not quite satisfying, in part because there are lots of potentially valid arguments out there. So there are also rules that you can have for the system, such as, for example, if an argument has two negative premises, it cannot have an affirmative conclusion. But much more importantly, for philosophical purposes, is the fact that from particular premises, you can't prove a universal conclusion. To prove a universal conclusion in Aristotelian logic, you have to have universal premises. So to prove that all of A is B, if that's your conclusion, you need to have universal premises saying, like all of A is C and all of C is B, right? Something like that. Now, the rule is not quite usually stated this way. It's usually put in terms of a concept called distribution, but I'm not going to tell you what distribution is. If you want to learn more about Aristotelian logic, take a logic class. It's not what this is. I'm just presenting you enough of the logical system in order to move forward with his other philosophical works. All right, now why is this important, this fact about universality? Well, it's going to be important because it means that Aristotelian logic, the deductive system of logic, is not going to tell us how we come to know that universal claims are true, at least not ultimately. And the reason why is that if you're going to prove a universal claim, you're required to already know that some other universal claim is true. Or, to put it in other words, to describe this a different way, there can't be more information in the conclusion of a categorical syllogism than there is in the premises. If you want to prove in deductive logic that something is true of every x, whatever x is, every fish, every donkey, every star, something like that, you already have to know something about every x. You can't build from particular claims about x to universal claims about x. That's against the rules of Aristotelian logic, and it would actually turn out to be basically against the rules of every form of deductive logic. So the question becomes, how do we get this universal knowledge if we can't get it by applying deductive logic to the particular things that we know? Now, if this question sounds a little familiar, it should. This is very similar to the problem that Plato was getting at in the Meno. If you have a model of reasoning on which reasoning is deductive, which all reasoning is deductive, as Plato seemed to be working with when he modeled reasoning on geometry, then it can be kind of a mystery how you could know any universal claims. And in Plato's case, how you could know the definitions that Plato, following Socrates, was looking for. Aristotle is going to address this problem of universal knowledge, or knowledge of universals, and where it comes from, in the Posterior Analytics. And it helps to know what he has to say about deductive logic when you get to that text, a text where he talks about the Meno, Meno's paradox, and where he starts exploring other kinds of reasoning that are needed for scientific knowledge. Before we finish up, and we are just about to finish up, I want to tell you a little something about logic and how it developed. So for around 2,000 years, Aristotelian logic was thought by almost everyone to be all, at least everyone in the Western tradition, to be all there was to know about logic. It was the only logical system anybody used. And the reason for that is, in its field of application, Aristotelian logic is pretty much perfect. It makes no mistakes. And it tells you all you need to know when it comes to reasoning that involves categorical propositions like this. But unfortunately, or at least unfortunately for the long-term reputation of Aristotle's logic, there are more arguments, more valid arguments you can make than those that you can make in this logical system. Consider the following argument. Premise 1, Peter is a Russian or Peter is a Pole. If Peter is a Pole, then he would speak Polish. That's premise 2. Premise 3, Peter cannot speak Polish. Conclusion, so Peter is a Russian. This argument is pretty clearly valid, but can Aristotle's logical system show you that it's valid? There seem to be all sorts of problems with it doing so, such as the fact that there are 3 premises here, not 2. That problem can actually be overcome. You can break this 3-premise argument down into 2 sub-arguments, each of which only has 2 premises. So first, you could say, if Peter is a Pole, then he would speak Polish. That's premise 1. Premise 2, Peter cannot speak Polish. Conclusion, Peter is not a Pole. A second argument, Peter is a Russian or Peter is a Pole. First premise. Second premise, Peter is not a Pole. Conclusion, so Peter is Russian. by making the reasoning a little more explicit and breaking the argument into two parts, as it were, you can make it a matter of syllogisms. Right? Aristotle thought you could do this with every argument. He thought every complex argument could be broken down into syllogisms. And maybe he's right, maybe he's not. It doesn't seem like he's right. But in this case, it works out. Right? What's looked like a three-premise argument could be turned into two-premise arguments. But are these categorical propositions we're dealing with? It doesn't seem like they are. You have an if-then claim. If Peter is a Pole, then he would speak Polish. You have an or claim. Peter is Russian or Peter is a Pole. These don't look categorical. They don't look like they're attributing some property to every member of a category or class. Now, you could interpret claims like Peter cannot speak Polish as all Peters are not Polish speakers. This, of course, is almost certainly false. It doesn't mean the same thing as Peter can speak Polish. The issue is you don't want to talk about all Peters. You want to talk about one Peter. But you can kind of create a category that only has one member in it, right? So you could say, by making the description more specific, you could say something like, my friend Peter, who was born in Kaliningrad. That's the category. There's only one person in there because you only have one friend named Peter who was born in Kaliningrad. And then say, all my friends named Peter who were born in Kaliningrad are not Polish speakers. So you could turn that sentence into a categorical claim. You could do the same thing for Peter is not a Pole. You could do the same thing for Peter is Russian. But what about Peter is Russian or Peter is a Pole? Is this something you can represent as a categorical claim? What about if Peter is a Pole, then he would speak Polish? It seems like Aristotelian logic has real limits. And basically every logician, people who do logic, now accepts this. And the process of discovering systems, logical systems, that could do what Aristotelian logic could not, for example, show why this argument is a valid argument, was one of the major projects and accomplishments of 19th century mathematicians and philosophers working together. At this point, there are logical systems out there that can do everything Aristotle's system can do, and more besides. So they can prove every valid argument that's valid in Aristotle's system, but they can also prove this argument about Peter to be valid. Aristotle's logic is at this point outdated. It still works perfectly well. In fact, it just necessarily works perfectly well for the small set of arguments it's designed to handle. But at this point, you only really learn about it as preparation to learning a more complicated, more powerful logical system. And if you want to learn more about it, take a logic course. So that's it for us on the Intro to Aristotle's Logic. This is about setting up the more properly philosophical readings we've got from Aristotle.